Hey all, here OS Reviews. Today we're taking a quick look at the GC26. This is a retro game emulator console that's affordable, budget-oriented, sells for under 30 bucks, and comes with 400 games built on in. Has a 3-inch display and a pretty Game Boy-inspired form factor, and what's slightly more unique about this model here is it actually comes also with a separate gaming controller that you can attach it to, link the console onto a larger display like a TV, and game on a bigger screen. So it comes with this joystick controller, which is kind of neat for this really low price. It can run for around 6 hours on a single charge. It comes in a variety of colors for the casing, from red to green to yellow. It actually connects onto the mini USB port of the console, so that when you're not charging the console, it can also supply data input by recognizing this control pad. The console itself with a included screen protector. We also have another mini USB cable, this time just for charging the system, and we have the AV cable for connecting it onto a TV. Now, I understand this is a budget model, so it's acceptable, but really I think going into the future, we should just replace AV cables with something like HDMI, since that is just so much more universal these days. Finally, we have just the user manual. Now, the console itself is also made out of a polycarbonate plastic, but at least it has an interesting texture to it, which is reminiscent of something like a softer, maybe leather material. With that being said, the buttons in terms of the lettering down below is a little harder to read because of this texturing. Start and select, and then reset is what this button is for. Otherwise, there's a mono speaker in the front, and then on the side here is where we have a volume dial to change it higher or lower. The top here also has a power on and off switch, mini USB there for charging and for the input for the controller, and also the AV out. Have a 800 milliamp hour capacity removable battery. Flicking the unit on, by default it always goes through a screen which allows you to select a language, either Chinese or English, so this is something you have to do every time when you turn it on, since I guess there isn't really a memory feature on here. We are talking about some fairly classic titles on here, like Super Mario Bros., Dr. Mario, and overall these are not going to be anything that's too different from other retro style handhelds we've seen in the past, but gives us a nice selection overall. And there's also fighting games like Super Contra. Goes through this list one by one. Now, I do wish there may have been a better way to kind of quickly search, but that's kind of the norm for these lower cost consoles, is you kind of have to cycle through using the D-pad. Most of these are for kind of NES style or Super Nintendo systems. There's actually not too much repetition though, so most of these are different games from each other, which is at least good to see compared to the early days of these super cheap consoles where oftentimes the bundled, say, 400 games would include ones which are just super similar to each other. There's also a handful of games which aren't really emulating older styles. They're just a rehashed version of a kind of a modern day mobile app. Now we can see in the list here, it does include something like Pokemon Blue. It's not really a real Pokemon game. It's another kind of homebrew style game, more in the style of Mario than anything. So this is an instance where we don't get kind of the true classic title as it was intended. But still, it's playable, and I guess first impressions here would be that the display quality is decent, but overall, if you look at it from various angles like this, it still is pretty decent as far as a cheap display is concerned. Now, to exit out of a particular game, you can tap on the restart to basically go back into this main screen. So it's a pretty primitive way in terms of the operating system. You don't get too much settings or things that you can customize. The Super Mario Bros., this is more of the classic title. You'll find the kind of full version of the game here, and it works quite well in terms of the playability. Controls and keys also feel pretty decent in terms of their overall responsiveness. D-pad is a little bit on the stiff side, but not bad considering the price. Buttons do feel relatively responsive and tactile, and not a ton of screen tearing or anything like that when you're actually playing back the game. Things are still, for the most part, performing smoothly. Of course, this is a very basic game, so nothing crazy in terms of graphics, but overall, definitely not bad. Definitely seen worse on something that's of this price range. A few of the games like Contra 24 in 1 actually includes also 24 games within one game. So technically, if you do the math, it equals more games than just 400, since some of the ROMs are inclusive of multi-games within one, which is kind of interesting. So let's just tap on the first one here, and we do have just Contra loading along. It's pretty similar to something like Super Mario in terms of the level of the graphics that we're seeing, but definitely still very much playable. and kind of a fun action-based game that you can use to progress through the various levels. Notably, the system is missing kind of more Nintendo Game Boy style games, despite the fact that it is styled like a Game Boy. You only find too many GBA-specific ROMs on here out of the 400 that they've included. So, as we saw earlier with the Pokemon instance, it doesn't really give you the full version of a real Pokemon game, which might be the biggest maybe slight shame if you are a Pokemon fan. It doesn't really get in the way of you being able to enjoy still lots of the kind of gaming experience, especially with finding maybe other titles which perhaps are a bit more niche or unknown to you at the time, but can still be, again, a very fun way to explore and still get plenty of gameplay and kind of fun out of the experience. Maybe the biggest limitation in terms of the gameplay experience that we are seeing here is the fact that we don't really have a way to save the state of the games. So these are still pretty simple titles, so it's not really too big of a deal, I suppose. Overall, though, still a pretty good value, I'd say, considering the low price, the fact you get a bundled controller, the fact that the construction quality of the console itself is definitely better than they once were for something of the same price. If we're considering the fact that, you know, it has a slight texture to the plastic, has a decent enough display that's pretty large and comfortable even in outdoor conditions for visibility, and overall fares better than you'll think. So that's more or less it as far as our kind of hands-on review of this GC26 all-in-one mini retro game console. Again, it's really meant for a budget option, not really a competitor to something crazy like a GPD series kind of Pocket or a Android-powered emulator, but it's really meant for reminiscing about the classics if you want something with physical buttons compared to, say, a touchscreen that we have on our phones. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the 401 GC26 retro game console.